October Girls presents Happy Hunting, where a ghost hunter finds exactly what he's looking for. Come on, Ma, Joe grumbled, hiking up his jeans as a carpet of little fall leaves crunched under his boots. That's enough pictures to fill 2 scrapbooks, and the tour hasn't even started yet. A sweet-faced old woman smiled and raised her phone up to gingerly snap another photo. Can you stand a bit closer to the sign, darling? This is the last one, I promise. No, let's go. We need to meet the caretaker. Boy, interjected his father. Do as your mother says. Joe grudgingly pressed his lips into a thin, forced smile, but refused to move an inch closer to that little white sign, with Villisca Axe Murder House, June 10th, 1912, painted in thin black slanted print. It was posted on the front yard of a modest slate-roofed home, complete with white wooden paneling, red-trimmed windows, and a neatly swept porch. A time capsule from ages past, untouched, unaltered. There we go. His mother examined the next snapshot. Grumpily, Joe pivoted on his heels and marched away. 42 years old and they still treat me like I'm a kid. Oh! Joe turned around to see that his mother had somehow managed to unbalance herself on the short walk up. He watched as his father, a burly, graying bear of a man, catch his tottering mother as she stumbled over the sloped lawn. His mother was not dainty by any means, using her advancing age to justify splurging on baked goods and sweets. She was already winded halfway up the lawn. Rolling his eyes, Joe turned back around and stepped onto the porch. Wooden planks groaned under his weight. Mr. Rosco? A thin rail of a man, clean-shaven and dressed in worn flannel and jeans, opened the front door. Its hinges squeaked in protest. He walked up to Joe, one hand extended and the other shielding his eyes from the evening sun. Joe nodded to confirm, but kept his hands buried deep and decidedly in his coat pockets. The man's hand hung there for a second before dropping to his side. He cleared his throat awkwardly. Nice to meet you. We're pleased to have you here. Midwestern pleasantry, laced with distaste. How original. My, are you Mr. Lyle? Said his mother, huffing as she finally caught up. She extended her hands to clasp Lyle's hand in a warm shake. Joey told me how he spoke with you on the phone earlier. How sweet of you to meet us here and give us a tour. I am Joey's mother, and this is his father. The man smiled. Yes, I'm Lyle. I take care of this place. Are you staying the night as well? Good heavens, no. We have a room booked at the nearby hotel. When we heard Joey was doing a video for his channel on this place, we just had to see it with our own eyes. But we don't have the stomach to stay the night. Our son is made of stronger stuff than we are. Joe's mother puffed up. My Joey has over 100,000 followers on his channel. Can you believe it? I am so proud of him. He goes into all manner of spooky places to make contact with the supernatural. Joe pushed his clenched fists deeper into his coat pockets, gnashing his teeth and inwardly begging his mother to shut the hell up. It was a huge mistake bringing his parents along. Yes, Villisca gets its fair share of ghost hunters. We're pleased to have someone of your caliber, Mr. Rosco. Lyle snapped his gaze toward Joe, coolly assessing him. Judgment coming off in waves. Screw you, Joe thought as he unzipped his jacket and he pulled back the sides, placing his hands on his hips. He smirked when Lyle briefly eyed the large hunting knife clipped to his belt. Clearing his throat once more, Lyle turned to Joe's parents. Shall we, start the tour? Seems like a good idea, Joe's father muttered. Mr. Rosco, did you bring any equipment? You're free to film, I just asked to not be in the video. No, I'm good. Joe half wanted to call the tour off entirely and drive off. But he needed the footage for his next video, and the cost of gas to get to this dusty old town in the middle of a state-sized cornfield kept him from unlocking his truck. I'll just get some footage after this asshole leaves, Joe thought. Lyle nodded and ushered Joe and his parents through the front door. Inside, preserved in the typical 20th century fashion, a simple kitchen outfitted with a wood-burning stove, antique cabinetry, and a small table draped in faded white lace greeted him. Joe was a large, beefy, and broad-shouldered man, and he immediately felt uncomfortable in this room. He took up too much space. The floors threatened to snap under his bulk. He shifted to the far corner of the room, allowing his mother, then his father, then Lyle to enter. How wonderful! It's like traveling back in time. Lyle smiled warmly at Joe's mother. Yes, almost everything here is original as the Moore family left it. Fascinating! She lifted her phone up, snapping pictures at the random kettle and dishware. Yeah, very, Joe mocked under his breath. I read all about this place. How unfortunate for the family and those poor children. What a tragedy, quipped Joe's mother. Yes, Lyle nodded solemnly. It was a dark day for this town. Now, where should we start? Mrs. Rosco, you already seem to know a lot about this place. Do you have any questions for me? Oh, yes. Please do start from the very beginning, though. My husband doesn't have as much background as me. I want him to leave with the full experience. Joe's father, already looking disinterested, shrugged his shoulders. Sure, might as well if we're here. Joe immediately zoned out, listlessly watching as his parents followed Lyle around a house that was both too small and too loud for 4 people. They entered a bedroom on the first floor. A neatly made bed on a white metal frame sat at the far right of the room. This was the same bed where 2 young girls laid, their skulls crushed from the blunt end of an axe. Blood soaked the mattress, crimson droplets falling into a dark pool on the floor. Joe could almost see the 2 prostrate little bodies, heads mysteriously covered with white cloths. He turned to see a small wooden dresser against the wall. Above it hung what Joe suspected was a mirror. It was cloaked in a dusty white shawl. True to what Lyle said, the house was kept nearly in the exact condition as the night of the murders, save for the sight of 8 pale bodies laying in their beds. Those poor girls. And they were friends of the children, right? Spending the night with their family? Asked his mother. Yes. Ina and Lena were their names. In this room, the murderer left the axe against the wall over here. Apparently, he even took the time to make himself breakfast afterwards, just like it was any other morning. Oh my goodness. It's a crying shame they never caught the monster. Lyle nodded soberly. It's said that the spirit of the murderer is still here, in this house, haunting his victims even in the afterlife. Bunch of bullshit, Joe thought, just like all the other so-called haunted houses. He crept closer to the mirror and carefully pulled up a corner of the shawl covering it. A dusty face pinched with annoyance peered back at him. Oh yes, you notice the mirrors are all covered here. No one knows why the murderer did that. Some say you can see the spirits of the victims in the reflection. Sure, Joe said, unconvinced. Outside, a gust of wind blew against the windows, shuddering them and making them squeal. Let's head upstairs. I will show you where the parents' room was and where the 4 more children slept. Releasing the cloth, Joe made to follow behind his father when something in the window caught his attention. A small figure, its head cloaked in a pale cloth, was reflected in the glass. Huh, not half bad. Joe had made his entire career off ghost hunting. He knew the tricks of the trade. Looking over his shoulder, Joe saw that the covered mirror's placement caught the window's reflection perfectly, just enough to cast a ghostly figure. Chuckling, Joe made his way out of the room and up the stairs to find Lyle and his parents in the last bedroom where the 4 more children met their gruesome end. Now, Lyle, you work here every day. Have you ever had a supernatural encounter here? Joe's mother asked excitedly, her eyes bright. Lyle smiled and leaned in as if to whisper a secret. Here we go. Joe rolled his eyes. Now, I have to be honest. Before this job, I was quite the skeptic. But once, when I was here, in this very room, I heard the front door open and slam shut. Now I was alone, taking care of a few things around the house, and there was no tour scheduled for the day. So, thinking that it was a local kid sneaking into the house, I decided to play a little prank on him, So, I hid in this closet and waited until I heard footsteps creaking from the kitchen to the stairs to the room just next door. Then, when I was sure he entered this room, I heard him stop right in front of the closet door. At that moment, I jumped out, but there was no one there. But I felt someone watching me. I'm not gonna lie, it was like the air was sucked out of me at that moment, like I jumped into a cold shower. I zipped right out of that house and I almost quit. How are you able to stay and work here after that? Well, someone's got to do the job, I guess. Never had any issues apart from that time. He gestured to the small ladder into a recess in the ceiling. Now follow me. The attic is our last stop. Mr. Rosco, you and your father might want to mind your heads as we enter. It's a bit cramped. Just like this entire house, Joe muttered. His father grumbled in agreement. In the child's room, the bed springs screeched under Joe's weight. He was tinkering with his camera, bringing the lens into focus. He had just wrapped up taking all the footage he needed outside the house. Earlier, his mother and father had packed up their blue sedan, driving off to settle into their hotel for the night. Good luck, darling. Don't go upsetting those poor souls, Joe's mother called out from their passenger side window, waving goodbye. Finally, some peace and quiet. Joe began to set up his equipment. Several cameras stood on tripods around the house. Microphones were turned to capture the slightest sound. It was dark outside by the time he was finished. An unnatural quiet settled over the house, save for the creaking of the floorboards and the shaking of the wind-blown panes. Perfect. I can manipulate those noises easily with the video. Joe held one camera in his hand and flashlight in another. The digital watch on his wrist glowed to report that it was just past midnight. Creaking down the stairs, each step woodenly crying as he descended, Joe felt something tickle the back of his neck, like a soft, breathy whisper. He paused, shining his flashlight behind him. He examined the hallway above. Nothing. What are you thinking, Joe Rosco? Just get this over with. Joe decided to start recording in the guest bedroom downstairs. A beep, and Joe slid into the persona known so well by his followers. He pinned a smile on his face and forced his voice into an excited pitch. Okay, people, we are in the very room where two little girls, Lena and Isla Stalinger, were brutally murdered by the Villisca Axe Murderer. We are recording around midnight here and hope to capture some activity before 12:45 a.m. That's when the murders were suspected to have happened, and when people say the spirits are most active. I'm going to turn off my flashlight and see if I can't communicate with any spirits here. Darkness enveloped him in an instant. Joe placed his camera on the dresser to face him, and he plopped down on the mattress. He pulled out his spirit box and flipped a switch. White noise, static and fuzzy, filled the room. Spirits! Are you here? Nothing. Going to have to find some voices and samples online to edit into here, Joe noted to himself. Then, the box blipped. A barely perceivable pause in the static. Joe went still. The fuck? Joey. A shrill, sing-song voice shattered his trance, and Joe jumped to his feet. The spirit box clattered to the floor. Light cut through the room, and Joe shined his flashlight all around him. The beam ran over the window. Joe, for the first time in his life, felt his blood run cold. A childlike figure, the same one from earlier that day, was reflected in the glass. Only this time, the white cloth covering the head was stained red. A frail hand reached up and slowly pulled the cloth down, exposing the splintered remnants of what was once a young face. One side was completely crushed, the other bulged. One eyeball dangled from stringy muscle and nerves. Shattered shards of skull poked through pale skin. Blood dripped down the front of her nightgown. And the hairs on the back of Joe's neck raised. His breath frosted in front of him. A little hand raised a finger to her unhinged jaw. A shuffle of feet behind him, and Joe swung his flashlight over to the other side of the room. But there was nothing. A creak cut into the silence, echoing across the ceiling above him. The flashlight in his hand flickered before going out. All he heard was the wheeze of his panicked breath and his heart pounding against his ribcage. Sweat dripped down his back. In the dark, all alone, he was paralyzed, straining to hear something. Anything. Then, a whisper, so faint Joe almost missed it. "I'm right here." Shock, like electricity, shot through him. He pulled out his knife. "Calm down. You're freaking yourself out, Joe. It's some trick. I bet you it's that jackass Lyle. Gotta keep the business coming in, you know?" "Lyle, you piece of shit! Stop it right now! I know it's you!" A giggle, soft and staticky, echoed out of the spirit box from where he had dropped it in the room. On the second floor, a series of thuds and footballs powdered above him. "Come at me, bitch! No one gets the best of Joe Rosco! Wait until I get my hands on you!" Joe seethed, groping around in the dark. The floorboards screamed at him with each step. He found the stairwell and started to slowly make his way toward it. A blast of cold air rushed through him, almost knocking him back. A skitter of footsteps darted behind him, running up the stairs. Fear blinded Joe, and bile shot through his throat. This couldn't be real. There was no way. Joe sprinted up the remaining steps, slamming into the hallway wall. He ran into the closet room. A crash, and the door swung shut behind him. He gasped for breath. Desperate, he shook his flashlight, begging for it to turn on. Then it did. A beam of light mercifully broke out through the shadows. He looked up, across the room, and on one of the beds laid a figure, motionless. What the? He crept to the bedside against his better judgment and fell back in horror, landing hard on his backside. What the? No, Ma, this isn't real. This can't be real. There was his mother, lying on her back, her hands neatly folded over her chest, as if fast asleep. His world began to spin. The flashlight began to dim again, blinking. Behind him, the door clicked open. A shuffle of feet rushed toward him. Joe spun around and, in the dying flicker of the light, saw the small, deformed child, its one eye swinging wildly, blood foaming around its mouth, scramble on all fours toward him. Clutching his knife, Joe roared, trying to get up, trying to flee. But a small hand, icy and tight as a vice, snatched his ankle and pulled him down. It climbed up his legs, scratching and screaming. It clawed his chest, his arms, his face. Frantic, Joe swung the knife as hard as he could. It crashed down, punching through flesh and bone. It was more than his heart could take. It seemed to explode. Then his flashlight glowed bright again. "Darlin'?" Joe couldn't believe his eyes. He saw his mother in front of him, her face tearful. "My darling, what have you done?" His mother croaked. Joe's hands felt slick, hot, sticky. I didn't mean to. Please don't go, Mom. I'm so scared." Joe felt his head being lifted, cradled by soft hands. A buzz grew in Joe's ears, creeping into his vision, making it fuzzy and blurred. He glanced over at the bed. It was empty. Then he looked down and gasped. His knife was buried in his own chest, his hand still on the handle. His wristwatch glowed, reading 12:46 a.m. With each strained breath he took, fresh blood bubbled from the wound and pooled underneath him. Darkness flooded Joe's vision, and the last thing he felt was a soft hand patting his cheek. "Shh, I'm right here." This story is inspired by a true event. On November 7th, 2014, the Villisca Axe Murder House made headline news when a ghost hunter, Robert Laursen Jr., was found by his parents early that morning in a pool of his own blood. A knife had been shoved into his chest. He had arrived earlier that day, intent on spending the night at the house in hopes of contacting the spirits famously trapped inside. He was life-flighted to a nearby hospital, where it was determined that his wound was self-inflicted. Laursen has since recovered from his injuries, but refuses to share any details of what transpired that night. Despite this, the Villisca Axe Murder House is still open for those brave enough to stay the night.